spectacular entrepreneur. Now, a little warning, I'm going to use a word that quite a few of you have told me you wish I didn't use so much, but there's no other word to describe what is going to happen in today's episode of the podcast. Today's episode is so juicy. It is so juicy. It's like hot gossip and a bit of a contentious conversation. It comes from a listener question and they've asked to remain anonymous because it's so juicy. So my apologies to everyone out there who doesn't like it when I use the word juicy, because that's the only way I know how to describe this conversation today. Plus, because it's day 7 of Tashmas, just like every other day of Tashmas, I've got a great gift for you, and I'll tell you a little more about that at the end of today's episode. This is episode number 468 of the Heart Centre Business Podcast, which means you can find all the relevant links and the show notes for today's episode over at tashcorbin.com/468. And today I've titled the episode, Are You Growing or Shrinking Your Trust Bank? And that is almost the answer to our listener question. That is the reason for today's juicy episode. So let's dive in so I can explain more. Hello, I'm Tash Corbin, a business strategist and mentor based on the Sunshine Coast in Australia. The mission of this podcast is to help heart-centered entrepreneurs to make more money and in doing so, change the world for the better. This podcast was recorded on the lands of the Gubbi Gubbi and Jinnaburra people. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Okie dokie. So today's episode actually comes from a listener question, but they have asked to remain anonymous for reasons which will become apparent to you once I dive into the questions that they have asked. But this was in response to a Facebook Live I did last year about agitation and admiration marketing. I also had included it in my regular newsletter in the CEO spot a couple of weeks in a row, where I was talking about some of the fear-based and admiration agitation marketing strategies and why it wasn't a consent-based practice and the impact that these kinds of strategies can have on your audience. Now, if you missed all of that, I won't go into detail about what agitation and admiration marketing are and all of the risks and benefits, because I do have another Tashmas episode of the podcast coming out shortly that dives into admiration and agitation marketing specifically. But just so that we're all on the same page, in a nutshell, admiration and agitation marketing is built on those two core principles in your content. So you have a lot of your content is putting yourself on a pedestal so that your audience admires what you have. So that might be sharing your results. It might be sharing your lavish lifestyle. It might be sharing your perfect relationship, your amazing photo shoots in designer label clothing. So it's all set up so that you're positioning yourself as one of the haves, as one of the people who've got it all figured out and who has this amazing lifestyle that everyone should be admiring and wishing that they have as well. And then the agitation side in particular is centered on ensuring that you are agitating your audience in their current state. So you're pointing out how painful life is without having everything figured out the way that you do, without having messaging that attracts 6-figure buyers and people who are ready to invest. It's agitating how people are currently feeling and really like dialing up their pain points. You're not just meeting them where they're at and saying that you understand their pain or that you can really connect with that or you've experienced it before. You're agitating it. You're making them feel like, if I don't sort this out soon, I'm just going to be so angry with myself. You may even like do stuff that makes people feel like they are less than, they're unworthy, there's something wrong with them because they haven't got it sorted yet. So we're not just talking about speaking to people's pain, we're talking about really agitating their pain, agitating the parts of their experience right now that are not ideal or that they're not enjoying, and making it feel like it's going to be like that forever, or it's only going to get worse if they don't buy from you. So it's got this admiration side and this agitation side. Now, our brave and plucky listener, who I've already replied to and praised for being so honest and open and vulnerable in asking this question, but I also just want to give them another little shout out. You know who you are. So they contacted me after seeing a lot of these Facebook Lives and some of my emails, and they basically said to me, look, Tash, I totally understand what you're saying, but I'm desperate to make some money right now. And even though I can see that for people who don't buy from me, I am making them feel less comfortable. I am, agitating their pain points and making them feel anxious about getting stuff sorted. To be honest, isn't it worth just doing it for a little bit to make some sales? And basically, if you can't beat them, why not join them? They also were kind of trying to give me permission to use this kind of marketing as well. They said that they knew I was rebuilding my business after some chronic health issues, and particularly after my surgery and everything that went wrong in 2021. And they were saying basically that they were sure my audience would forgive me if I resorted to using some of these tactics for a short term to get a bunch of income back in the door, and that would then set me up to be able to have more support in my business, to market my business more widely, because I'd be able to cash in on the trust and connection and all of the value that I have been sharing with my audience over the last 12 years. And they basically said, we'll forgive you. Don't you think it's worth it to use some of this and make that short-term gain, given that it's only inflicting short-term pain on your audience? And 95% of us would totally forgive you, Tash. Now, I have to admit a few things that this email absolutely brought up for me. The first was, it was very ego boosting to feel like my audience trust me and are so grateful for the content and resources that I put out that they would let me be an absolute jerk and use dodgy sales tactics and they would still forgive me and stick around. That's pretty good for my ego. But I also need to admit that this is a conversation Honest Davey, my partner and I have actually had before. He's literally said to me, with 3 months of just milking it and going hard and using all of these dodgy tactics, I could make millions of dollars, and then we could go live a beautiful life off grid, travel in the world, having a fabulous time, and just disappear, basically. And it is that sense of, if you can't beat them, why not join them? But even though in my, let's say, darkest hour, I have had some of those thoughts myself, I choose not to engage in that style of marketing because of the trust bank. The trust bank works like a regular bank account, in that you make deposits and you make withdrawals. Things like creating content that's really helping people, having connection to people, being of service, showing up regularly, being reliable. These things can really deposit into your trust bank and build the trust that your audience has with you. But there are some things that you can do that withdraw from the trust bank. It might be that you post sales after sales after sales post, or you just constantly in promo mode. Maybe you promoted or shared the content of someone who was untrustworthy, or you made a mistake, or you've done something that has eroded people's trust. It's not always that like creating and content and giving advice is adding and then promoting is withdrawing. Sometimes sharing a specific offer can add to people's trust bank because it shows people the work that you do, or it's demonstrating the power of your processes and how you actually work with people. So it's not always a black and white, good and bad, plus or minus, depending on the activity. Just like creating content isn't always adding to the trust bank. In fact, I recently watched a webinar that completely eroded my trust of a provider because the webinar was supposed to deliver on 3 key outcomes. And after sitting and watching this webinar for almost 2 hours, I hadn't achieved any of those 3 outcomes. In fact, I realized I was trying to be sold into a program at multiple thousands of dollars in order to get those 3 outcomes. So the webinar had been promoted to deliver on something that it didn't deliver on, and I wasted almost 2 hours sitting through a long-winded sales pitch that didn't deliver on what I had been promised. That one was such a big withdrawal from the trust bank that it's actually closed. I will never spend a cent with that person. In June of 2025, I will have been in business for 12 years. And you don't have that kind of longevity, that kind of momentum, and that kind of consistent growth in your business by taking the short-term approach. Yes, in response to the listener question, I could potentially use some admiration and agitation messaging, some dodgy sales tactics to generate a huge spike in my income and a huge influx in my own personal wealth. But at the end of the day, I know it's going to come at a cost to me and to my business, not just at a cost to my audience. I am in a very fortunate position that I can afford not to resort to that trickery and those tactics these days because my business income is sustained, it's consistent, and it's definitely still recovering, but it's growing far more consistently year on year after my illness. And so I also want to acknowledge that you're not alone if you sometimes have these thoughts about just doing the dodgy. You're not alone if you sometimes have these thoughts about just borrowing these tactics and borrowing these strategies, using them for a short period of time and hoping that enough of your audience forgives you and lets you get away with it that you can rebuild later. But personally, that's not a risk that I'm willing to take. And also for me, the impact on my audience and the impact on the people who are affected by particularly using agitation in my marketing, it just isn't worth it. That's not the kind of impact I want to have in the world. That's not the kind of thing I want to do to people. It's kind of like the equivalent to me of the way that sometimes keyboard warriors are much crueler and they're much more likely to be abusive online and in the comments when they have the security of doing it from an online account and in the distance. Whereas if they were having a conversation with that person in real life, or if they met that person in real life, they would never be brave enough to say that to the person's face. They would never be brave enough to give that criticism or be that bullying or that dismissive of someone's feelings if the person was there in front of them. It was a great question that I saw in some training for young people about social media. And it said, before you post something in the comments or you share something online, ask yourself, would you say that to the person's face if they were standing right in front of you? And so I think about the marketing strategies and tactics that I use and the content that I share online in that very same way. Would I speak to someone this way if they were standing in front of me and I had to stand there and witness their response? If I had to witness their pain being agitated, if I had to witness them feeling more and more anxious with every single post of mine that they read in real life, would I do that to someone? Now, I don't want to do that to someone even if I don't have to witness it, but that picturing myself witnessing it in real life really hits home that that is not who I want to be, and that is not how I want to treat people. Instead, I'm here for the long term. I'm here for the long haul. And knowing that about myself and about my business, I can focus on every day aiming to grow the trust bank rather than shrink it. If I am making deposits into the trust bank every single day, every time I show up in my business, I know that I'm looking after the long-term sustainability of my business. I'm looking after my long-term cash flow. I'm looking after my long-term reputation, but I'm also looking after my audience. I'm also looking after my listeners. I'm also looking after the people who see my content. Both sides of that equation are important to me. But here's the other thing. I also know that my consistent growth in sales and my consistent growth of my audience, growth of my podcast listenership, and growth of the leads and sales that I'm making in my business is because I don't resort to trickery and short-term tactics to get the sale across the line. Using consent-based marketing practices and consent-based sales strategies means that I have lower unsubscribe rates and lower refund rates than most of my peers in my industry. And I know this from not only the conversations that I have with peers and friends in the industry, but also because some of the webinar conversion rates that big leaders in the industry are like bragging about are nowhere near as high as my webinar conversion rate. And in some launch training and launch programs that I've paid for, the facilitator talks about like the unsubscribe rate that they get from their launches, and mine is minuscule compared to theirs. And so because I have that lower churn and burn rate, it means that I build longer term relationships with people. I have higher conversion rates in my launches, but I'm also losing less people from my audience as I go. So my overall spend on growth is far lower. To me, consent-based marketing practices aren't just good for values alignment and making me feel good about the overall impact of my business. It's better for my business because at the end of the day, I make more money than if I was to use those churn and burn strategies. Now, that might not be true in a very short period of time, but over the long distance, I definitely come out on top. And look, I know I haven't yet had $1 million turnover year in my business. I've come close a couple of times, but I haven't yet crossed that threshold. But I do not believe at all that the reason why I haven't crossed that threshold has anything to do with the fact that I've chosen consent-based marketing practices over agitation and admiration or coercion-based marketing practices. There are so many other factors involved. Number one, I have not consistently invested in audience and in particular mailing list growth for an extended period of time. That has been interrupted by a range of different factors, Not least being my fluctuating health and well-being. And sometimes I just need to really bring my expense rate down and really bring my spending down to go through some of those periods of contraction because I don't have the sustained energy and focus and capacity to be in growth mode in my business. Another big reason is that there are a lot of foundations in my own marketing strategy that are still things that I need to take care of. I have had a horrendous website for many, many years, and I know that. And because of my situation with chronic illness and fluctuating energy, I haven't been able to or chosen to prioritize getting that website sorted. It is a hot mess behind the scenes, and it's going to either take hours and hours and hours of focus from me, or it's going to take tens of thousands of dollars to get someone to help me fix it. And in the face of all of the dramas, distractions, and disruptions that I have experienced since 2021, my business has continued to at least be able to pay its way. Pay my team, pay myself, pay my taxes, although I had to do it on a payment plan. But my business has been able to sustain itself, and I've been able to maintain that relationship, that connection, and that trust with not only my paying clients, but also with my audience through months and months on end when I wasn't able to work. And then through months and months where the most I could do was 5 hours a week and then 8 hours a week. I remember very clearly at the start of 2022, my goal was to increase my work hours to 15 hours a week. That was my goal, to work more hours. And in 2023, I set a goal to work more hours in my business. By focusing my energy and attention on trying to add to the trust bank more than I withdrew from it, by trying to add to the trust bank every single day if I could, I have been able to sustain the longevity of my business through circumstances and situations that have absolutely decimated other businesses. And so that is something that I also really remind myself of if I am ever feeling that doubt, if I am ever feeling like maybe I should just go to the dark side. I remind myself that part of the reason why I'm still here is because I chose to prioritize my values and prioritize ensuring the long-term sustainability and trust of my audience and of my business. And consent-based marketing is the core reason why I have been able to do that and why my business feels so aligned and consistently energizes me rather than draining me. Which brings me to your Tashmas gift for today. Because if you are someone who also values consent-based approaches to business and you want to build your skills in learning how to sell and make sales with consent-based marketing, that's exactly what I cover in my course, Skyrocket Sales. It's a 6-module self-study program so you can take it at your own pace. The Skyrocket Sales program walks you through understanding the stages of the sales process, consent-based sales, and buyer psychology, so that you can skyrocket your sales. Make sure that you come on over to the show notes of today's episode at tashcorbin.com/468 because your Tashmas gift today is a coupon code that reduces the price of the Skyrocket Sales program to just $50. You can find out more and grab your link at tashcorbin.com/468. This coupon will work all the way up until the end of Tashmas. So you've got until the 12th of March, 2025 to come and grab your discounted spot in Skyrocket Sales. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the Heart-Centered Business Podcast. And until next time, I cannot wait to see you shine. I'll see you tomorrow for day 8 of Tashmas.